Usually when we talk about like a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of total precision.
Right. Yeah. Like engineering almost.
Exactly. It feels like engineering. You break your arm, you go to the hospital, they take an x-ray, and it shows that, that jagged white line right across the bone.
And the doctor just points at it.
Right. They just point and say, there it is. That's the problem. It's super clean, it's binary, and honestly, it's comforting.
Because, I mean, a visible problem implies a straightforward solution.
Yeah.
You put a cast on it, you wait 6 weeks, and, the line disappears.
But then you step into the world of macroeconomics or, human development, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just completely broken.
Oh, totally broken.
We end up looking at this diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky. So for you listening, imagine you're looking at the vital signs of an entire nation.
Okay.
You pull up a chart for a country that has grown its Human Development Index, its HDI, by over 40% since 1990.
Which is huge.
A 40.6% increase, to be exact.
I mean, if you saw a stock portfolio grow that steadily over 3 decades, you'd be absolutely thrilled.
You'd be rich.
Right. It looks like a massive, unmitigated success story on paper.
It really does. You see that upward curve and you think, okay, they've figured it out. But what if, like, the moment you apply a special filter to that exact same score?
The inequality filter.
Exactly. A filter that specifically measures inequality. Over 35% of that hard-won progress just instantly vanishes.
Oof.
Gone. You're left holding, like, a fraction of the success you thought you had.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Yeah, it really is.
And it represents this profound paradox in how we measure human progress globally. We're looking at a system where a country can be, like, simultaneously accelerating forward.
Structurally holding itself back.
Exactly. Holding itself back at the exact same time.
And that paradox is exactly what we are tearing apart today on this deep dive. We're unpacking the human development trajectory of Senegal from 1990 to 2023.
It's a fascinating timeline.
It really is. We are looking at 3 decades of intense, highly granular reporting from the United Nations and other global development agencies.
We've got data on expected schooling, adult literacy, per capita income,
life expectancy, gender inequality, and even planetary pressures like carbon emissions.
the whole stack.
The whole stack. And the central mystery we are trying to solve for you today is this. Why aren't simple economic and educational inputs enough to cross this invisible chasm between Senegal and the global average?
To really understand that invisible chasm, you first have to understand the scale of the marathon we're actually measuring.
Right, because HDI isn't just one thing.
Exactly, it's a composite. It was created to push back against the old idea that gross domestic product, just raw money, was the only way to measure a country's success.
Because money doesn't equal quality of life.
Right. HDI brings in health and education to create a much more three-dimensional picture of human capability.
Okay, so to give the listener some immediate context on where Senegal stands in this marathon, they are currently ranked 178 out of 203 countries.
As of 2023, yeah.
Right. And their Human Development Index score sits at 0.530.
Which officially places them in the low human development category.
But, and this is a huge, but if you only look at that current rank, that 178, you're completely missing the forest for the trees.
Oh, absolutely.
The true story isn't found in a static ranking. It's hidden within the unique, highly contradictory shape of the 33-year climb it took to get to that number.
Because when you look at the raw trend line, the very first thing that hits you is that Senegal is objectively moving forward.
The historical context is so vital here.
Yeah, let's go back to 1990. Senegal's HDI was 0.377.
That's a vastly different world.
Totally.
1990 is like the end of the Cold War, the very beginning of the hyperglobalization era. And at that time, the world average HDI was roughly 0.60.
So Senegal was starting with a severe handicap right out of the get.
A massive gap. And fast forward to 2023, Senegal climbs from that 0.377 up to 0.530.
Which represents a tremendous amount of ground covered. I mean, that's a genuine mobilization of resources and human effort.
But here is the brutal reality of global economics. The rest of the world didn't just sit still and wait for Senegal to catch up.
Right, the target moved.
Exactly.
Right.
Over that same 33-year period, the global average moved up to 0.756.
Which means The numerical gap between Senegal and the rest of the world remains a very stubborn 0.226.
It's the macroeconomic equivalent of running on a treadmill.
A very frustrating treadmill.
Yeah, and it's not a standard treadmill. The belt is slowly, constantly speeding up.
I actually often think about whether it's even fair to compare a developing nation's raw gap against a global average that is so heavily skewed by, ultra-wealthy Western nations.
That's a really good point.
Because if the starting lines in 1990 were fundamentally different, shaped by completely different histories of colonization and resource extraction, are we measuring the distance to the finish line, or should we just be looking at the speed of the runner?
That debate is completely at the heart of modern development economics.
Right.
Is the standard inherently biased? Yeah, to a degree. But we have to remember what the Human Development Index actually measures.
It's not just a relative race.
No, it measures absolute human capabilities. It measures the tangible ability of a human being to live a long and healthy life, the ability to acquire knowledge, and the ability to achieve a decent standard of living.
So while we can and definitely should applaud the speed of the runner, because Senegal's growth rate is commendable.
It reflects real human triumphs.
Exactly. But the absolute gap still matters immensely, because the global average represents this system of compounding advantages.
Compounding advantages. Let's really break down what that actually looks like in practice, because it's not just some corporate buzzword.
Right, it's the physics of the global economy.
So think about a country that already possessed a high HDI in 1990.
Okay.
Because they already had a highly educated population, they were perfectly positioned to invent and monopolize the digital revolution.
Oh, sure, Silicon Valley, all of that.
Right, and that complex technology generated massive corporate wealth. That wealth was taxed by the state to build state-of-the-art research hospitals and fund public universities.
Which then produced even healthier, even more highly educated workers.
Exactly. Who then went on to invent the next generation of, say, artificial intelligence. It's this virtuous cycle that accelerates on its own momentum.
The structural wealth gets structurally wealthier.
Yes. It's not just money compounding in a bank account. It's human capability compounding across generations.
So even if Senegal is running significantly faster now than it was in the 90s, the compounding advantages of the highly developed world mean that a simple, linear progression just isn't going to be enough.
No, closing that gap requires exponential structural leaps.
Otherwise, you're just running faster and faster on a treadmill that's like slowly tilting uphill.
And we can actually see the strain of that treadmill in the data timeline. If you trace the data points year by year, you see this steady incline throughout the 1990s.
But then right around the year 2000, the growth rate visibly accelerates.
The slope gets much steeper.
Yeah, you look at 2001, 2005, 2010, it's this relentless, determined march upward.
What happened around 2000 to cause that inflection point?
Well, it maps onto major political transitions in Senegal, the implementation of much more aggressive poverty reduction strategies, and just increased integration into global markets.
Okay, so the momentum was palpable.
It was, until we hit a concrete wall.
The years 2019 through 2021.
The global pandemic.
Right. The data shows progress just completely stalling out. Senegal's HDI flatlined, moving from 0.520 to only 0.522 across those excruciating years.
It's a really stark visual representation of how a global shock can just freeze human development in its tracks.
Especially for nations that don't have the fiscal space to just, print trillions of dollars in relief funds.
Exactly. But the resilience in the data set is equally notable, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, by 2022, the index ticks back up to 0.526 and then hits that 0.530 mark in 2023.
So they absorbed a generational macroeconomic punch and just kept moving forward.
They did. But to really understand why that 0.226 gap won't close, to understand the internal friction holding Senegal back from those exponential leaps.
We have to stop looking at the HDI as a single number.
Right. We have to tear the index apart into its three raw ingredients.
Education, health, and wealth.
Because they do not behave the same way.
They behave wildly differently. And the friction you're talking about is most visible and honestly perhaps most frustrating in the very first pillar, education.
The education data is fascinating because it contains this massive, undeniable victory that is immediately followed by a profound roadblock.
We're looking at a classic funnel problem. Let's start with the victory. We have a metric called expected years of schooling, or EYS.
Right.
This measures how many years of school a young child entering the education system today can expect to receive, assuming prevailing enrollment rates stay constant.
It's essentially a measure of a nation's promise to its youth.
In 1990, a child in Senegal was expected to get about 4.3 years of schooling.
Functionally, that is barely getting through elementary school.
Right. You learn to read, you learn basic arithmetic, and then you're pulled out.
Likely to work in agriculture or informal labor. It's an educational foundation that absolutely cannot support a modern, diversified economy.
But look at 2023. That number skyrocketed to 9.143 years.
That is a staggering 110% increase over 3 decades.
It's a total transformation of societal expectations.
And the data doesn't show a smooth, gradual crawl to that number either. If you really dig into the spreadsheets, there's an incredible anomaly.
Oh, yeah, around 2011.
Yes. Between 2010 and 2012, expected schooling leapt from roughly 8.1 years to over 9 years almost overnight.
That kind of sharp vertical movement in demographic data, that doesn't happen organically.
No, it's not a cultural shift.
That is the footprint of a massive structural push.
It points directly to government mandates and international partnerships aggressively overhauling the system.
We're talking about the physical construction of hundreds of rural schools.
The elimination of prohibitive school fees that kept low-income families out.
And large-scale initiatives specifically designed to get kids, especially girls, into classrooms en masse.
It's the moment the concrete foundation of a modern workforce gets poured.
And frankly, it is something to celebrate. Doubling the expected educational lifespan of a child changes the trajectory of millions of families.
It really does.
But here's where the sobering reality of macroeconomics sets in, because expected schooling is only half the equation.
Right. It introduces what economists refer to as the stock versus flow problem.
This concept blew my mind when I realized what the Senegalese data was actually saying.
No.
Walk us through how stock and flow apply to human knowledge.
Okay, so in basic economics, flow represents the new inputs entering a system right now.
Like water flowing into a bathtub.
Exactly. Stock is the accumulated reservoir of what's already there, the water sitting in the tub.
Got it.
So, expected years of schooling is a flow metric. It measures the promise given to the new generation currently entering the pipeline.
But the stock metric?
The measurement of what the country actually has to work with right now is mean years of schooling, or MYS.
And MYS specifically measures the actual realized years of formal education of the adult population.
Specifically, people aged 25 and older.
Right. It tells us the current educational reality of the existing workforce that is operating the economy today.
So we know the flow is looking highly promising at over 9 years.
But the actual stock, the mean years of schooling for adults in Senegal in 2023, is a mere 2.935 years.
Less than 3 years of formal schooling for the average adult.
And to put that into the harsh light of the global context, the world average mean years of schooling in 2023 is 8.775 years.
Senegal's adult workforce is operating with roughly 1/3 of the formal education of the global average.
So imagine a tech company that just secured a massive round of funding.
Okay, I like this analogy.
They go out and buy state-of-the-art laptops, premium software licenses, and cloud servers for all their brand new interns.
That's the expected years of schooling, the flow.
Exactly. The potential energy in that building is through the roof. But the senior management team, the middle managers, the people actually running the supply chains, doing the accounting, and managing the daily operations.
They've never seen a computer before.
They've never seen a computer. That is the mean years of schooling. The stock, the potential is undeniably there, but the immediate conversion of that potential into innovation, or in this case, a modern high-yield economy, is totally bottlenecked.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the education deficit. It reveals a massive structural, generational divide within the country.
You've successfully built the foundation by getting the kids into school.
But the economic payoff of education, the mechanism that actually raises national wages, attracts foreign direct investment for high-tech industries, and modernizes agricultural practices.
That requires an adult workforce with accumulated deployable knowledge.
You cannot pivot to an advanced manufacturing sector or build a digital service economy today with a labor force that averages less than 3 years of formal schooling.
The current economic productivity basically has a hard ceiling bolted onto it.
And this brings up a brutal reality about the lag time in human development. Educational investments have a 20 to 30-year delay before they pay significant macroeconomic dividends.
Because kids take a long time to grow up.
Exactly. The children who benefited from that massive jump in expected schooling back in 2011 are only just now, in the mid-2020s, beginning to age into the adult workforce.
Oh, wow. So we are standing exactly on the precipice right now.
We are just now going to see if that robust flow can finally start diluting the stock and raising the national average.
But for the last 30 years, that 2.9 years of adult schooling has been acting like a heavy anchor dragging behind the economy.
It explains a vast amount of the friction in their overall development score. But, education is only one pillar. We have to look at how this population is actually living.
Which brings us to the second pillar of the HDI, health and life expectancy.
And unlike the frustrating bottleneck of adult education, there is a powerful, undeniable public health narrative hidden in these numbers.
It's a massive systemic win. Let's look at the raw numbers. Life expectancy in Senegal was roughly 56.6 years back in 1990.
If you were born in that era, that was your statistical horizon.
By 2023, it reached 68.68 years.
We really need to pause and appreciate the sheer human weight of that statistic.
Yeah.
That is 12 full years of life added to the average citizen.
12 years. Imagine someone handing you an extra 12 years.
It's incredible.
That's a decade plus to spend with your family, to see your grandchildren grow up, to contribute to your community, to pass down cultural knowledge.
It's almost unfathomable progress when you strip away the macroeconomic jargon and think about it on a purely human level.
And the mechanics behind adding 12 years to a national average are incredibly complex.
It doesn't happen by accident.
Right. It requires a massive reduction in infant and child mortality rates, which heavily skew life expectancy averages.
It means widespread vaccination campaigns, the distribution of anti-malarial bed nets,
Significant improvements in clean water access.
and basic sanitation infrastructure expanding beyond the capital city.
And what's crucial to note from the data is the structural resilience of this health metric. Obviously, the global pandemic had a severe, tragic impact worldwide.
In Senegal, life expectancy dropped to 67.7 years in 2021,
A statistical loss of about a year.
which represents a devastating human toll.
But unlike the economic structures, which we'll see in a minute, are incredibly fragile, this public health metric rebounded vigorously.
Yes, by 2023, it had pushed past its pre-pandemic high to reach that 68.68 figure.
They absorbed the shock, and the underlying health infrastructure held.
And if we bring our global treadmill back into the picture, the world average life expectancy in 2023 is 73.38 years.
So Senegal is roughly 4.7 years behind the global benchmark.
But here's the vital context. That gap is actively and rapidly shrinking.
Really?
Yeah, in 1990, the gap between Senegal and the world average was nearly 8.5 years.
Oh, wow. So they have nearly cut the life expectancy gap in half.
Exactly. That implies a robust, bottom-up improvement in basic survival conditions. People are surviving childhood, and they're living longer as adults.
But the longer you live, the more resources you require to sustain that life.
And there's the other shoe dropping.
Yep. We've seen the education gap, we've celebrated the health victory. Now we have to look at the third pillar, wealth, specifically gross national income, or GNI, per capita.
This is where the development story takes a very sobering turn.
In 1990, Senegal's GNI per capita was $2,924. Now, it is crucial to understand that this is measured in constant 21 PPP terms.
Let's quickly define PPP for the listener.
Good call.
PPP stands for Purchasing Power Parity. It's an economic adjustment that accounts for inflation and the actual cost of living in a specific location.
So it's not just a raw currency conversion.
Right. It gives us a true apples-to-apples comparison of what that money can actually buy on the ground in local markets in Senegal over time.
Okay, so in 1990, the average citizen has a real-world purchasing power of $2,924 a year.
Right.
By 2023, after 33 years of modernization, after adding 12 years to the national life expectancy, after doubling the expected schooling of their children,
The GNI per capita only grew to $4,202.
it reveals a profound structural economic bottleneck it has barely moved.
Barely.
It's an increase of about 43% over 3 entire decades. While life expectancy grew by 20% and expected schooling grew by over 100%, the actual purchasing power of the citizens absolutely crawled.
A 43% growth spread over some 3 years averages out to barely over 1% a year.
Ouch.
And when you factor in the robust population growth that naturally accompanies higher survival rates, the economy is essentially just treading water.
It's expanding just enough to absorb the new citizens being born, but it is not deepening the wealth of the individuals.
And the data shows just how fragile that water treading is. Between 2019 and 2020, GDI per capita actually shrank
It went backward.
from $4,052 down to $4,037.
That negative growth perfectly highlights the vulnerability of the Senegalese economy to global shocks.
When an economy relies heavily on informal labor, subsistence agriculture, or undiversified raw exports, it is incredibly susceptible to supply chain disruptions or global downturns.
Let's talk about that informal labor market because that is the reality for so many people.
It's massive.
We're talking about street vendors in Dakar, small-scale peanut farmers in the rural regions, unregulated artisan trades.
These jobs provide daily survival, but they don't scale.
Exactly. A street vendor cannot leverage technology to suddenly sell 10,000 times more goods the way a software company can.
Right. Informal labor lacks legal protection, it lacks access to capital and credit, and it doesn't generate tax revenue for the state to reinvest in infrastructure.
It's a survival mechanism, not an engine for compound macroeconomic growth.
So if you're listening, try to build a mental model of Senegal right now based on this data.
Okay.
You have a society where people are living 12 years longer, their kids are expected to be in school twice as long as they were.
But their wallets, their actual ability to buy food, secure housing, or start a business are barely thicker than they were in the early 90s.
How does a society manage that kind of psychological and economic tension?
It creates immense social pressure. You're cultivating an increasingly educated youth demographic that naturally expects a modern, globalized standard of living.
They have smartphones, they see the world.
But they're graduating into an economy that hasn't structurally transformed to provide the high-paying, formal jobs they expect.
You have the interns with the new laptops, but the modern company hasn't been built for them to work at.
That tension must be palpable. But those average income numbers we just discussed are hiding a much darker reality.
Because averages lie.
Averages are a mathematical convenience, but they do not reflect human experience.
Right. If one person in a room has 10 apples and 9 people have 0, the average is 1 apple per person.
But the reality for 90% of the room is starvation.
Exactly.
To understand why an increase in national wealth isn't translating to universal well-being, we have to talk about the distribution of that wealth.
We have to look at the hidden thief that we mentioned at the very start of this analysis.
The reason why that 35% of progress vanishes.
We have to talk about the inequality-adjusted HDI, or IHDI.
So the United Nations doesn't just stop at calculating that baseline HDI score of 0.530.
Right. They run a secondary diagnostic.
They calculate how unequally those gains in health, education, and income are actually distributed across the population.
It serves as a harsh reality check on the national average.
And when you apply that inequality correction to Senegal, the score plummets. It drops from 0.530 all the way down to 0.340.
Mathematically, that represents an overall value loss of 35.49%.
Over a third of their human development value is just erased from the ledger because it's hoarded by a fraction of the population.
And to put that nearly 36% haircut into context, the world average loss to inequality in 2023 is only about 21.95%.
So every country loses some value to inequality. Nowhere is perfectly egalitarian.
True.
But Senegal is losing development value at a rate drastically higher than the global norm.
The structural friction here is immense. A rising national HDI score, that steady climb we traced from 1990, means very little if the gains are isolated.
How does this inequality physically manifest in Senegal? I mean, it's not just a spreadsheet phenomenon.
No, it's largely spatial and geographic. It's almost a tale of two countries living within the same borders. If the new research hospitals, the advanced secondary schools, and the formal economic growth are all clustered in small urban pockets, specifically the capital city of Dakar and the coastal economic zones, the national average goes up.
But the vast rural populations in the eastern regions, or the Casamance, are essentially left living in the 1990s. Imagine you earn a $100 paycheck every week. You work grueling hours for it. But because of a structural, unavoidable inequality tax built into your company's payroll system, $35 is immediately vanished before you even see the check.
Just gone.
You have to survive, feed your family, and pay rent on $65, even though on paper the company reports you as a $100 earner.
That is the macro reality of Senegal's development right now.
And what makes this tax so insidious is that it isn't collected by the government to be redistributed.
No, it's collected by the sheer inefficiencies of a system that leaves millions of its own citizens outside the modern economy.
In fact, if we look at the Multidimensional Poverty Index, which measures severe deprivations in health, education, and living standards at the household level, roughly 45.1% of Senegal's population lives in multidimensional poverty.
Almost half the country.
Yes. And the data shows that the primary drivers of this poverty aren't just a lack of income.
Alrighty.
The major deprivations are in basic nutrition, lack of school attendance, and a reliance on rudimentary cooking fuels, which causes severe respiratory issues.
Wow. This is what the inequality tax looks like on the ground.
But inequality isn't just about the rich in Dakar versus the poor in the rural East.
Right.
If we peel back one more layer of the data, it's not just geography that dictates who gets taxed, it's biology.
The wealth gap is hiding a much more severe survival gap.
And this brings us to arguably the most fascinating, wild, and contradictory data in the entire stack we're looking at today.
And the gender paradox.
The metrics tracking gender, the Gender Development Index, or GDI, and the Gender Inequality Index, GII, tell a story of incredible, almost unbelievable contrasts.
Let's establish the baseline first with the GDI. Senegal sits in what the UN classifies as Group 4, with a 2023 GDI of 0.924.
When we split the main HDI score by gender, the divides become crystal clear.
The female HDI is 0.509. While the male HDI is noticeably higher at 0.550.
And if we look back at our earlier discussion on the adult education bottleneck, the gender divide within that bottleneck is incredibly stark.
It really is. Adult women in Senegal average only 2.45 years of schooling,
2.5 years.
while men average over 3 years. Both numbers are critically low by global standards, but the men still hold a significant advantage in actual educational attainment over the women.
Okay, so that sets the stage. A clear, measurable disadvantage for women in the basic metrics of modern survival.
But then you bring in the Gender Inequality Index, where Senegal ranks 133rd out of 182 countries.
And this is where the data becomes wild. I need you to help me reconcile two data points that seem like they belong in completely different centuries, let alone different countries.
Let's look at the negative side of the ledger first. The structural vulnerabilities that threaten women's lives.
Right. We look at the maternal mortality ratio, the MMR. In Senegal, it is dangerously high at 260.88 deaths per 100,000 live births.
Furthermore, the adolescent birth rate is roughly 60 births per 1,000 young women ages 15 to 19.
These aren't just statistics on a page.
No, they point to deep, life-threatening structural failures regarding reproductive health infrastructure, access to emergency obstetrics, and bodily autonomy for women.
A maternal mortality rate that high means childbirth is a statistically significant gamble with a woman's life.
It's an incredibly grim reality.
But then, in that exact same data set, under the exact same index, we look at the metric for political power, the share of seats in parliament.
Women hold a staggering 46.06% of parliamentary seats in Senegal.
Wait, I really want the magnitude of this to sink in for the listener.
It's an exceptional figure that defies the surrounding data.
They are absolutely crushing the global average for women in parliament, which is only around 26.5%. Senegal has almost double the global average for female political representation at the highest level of legislative government.
Almost half the parliament is female.
That is higher than the United States. That is higher than the UK.
It is nearly gender parity at the elite level of governance.
But at the exact same time, in the exact same country, their maternal mortality is dangerously high, and adult women barely have 2.5 years of schooling.
It's completely divergent.
How is this possible? How do these two completely divergent realities exist in the same ecosystem?
It forces us to confront perhaps the most important question in political economics. How does elite power actually translate to the ground?
Right?
The dichotomy you're pointing out perfectly illustrates the fundamental difference between top-down institutional reform and bottom-up infrastructural development.
Top-down versus bottom-up. Unpack the mechanics of that for us.
High parliamentary representation, like Senegal's 46%, is rarely the result of a slow, organic cultural shift in developing nations.
What is it then?
It's almost always the result of deliberate institutional quotas. In 2010, Senegal passed a landmark parity law requiring all political parties to ensure that at least half their candidates for local and national elections were women.
Wow, so it's a top-down mandate.
Exactly. Yeah. The government engineered the electoral system to guarantee representation.
You pass a law, you enforce a quota, and the physical composition of the room changes overnight.
Exactly. It's a stroke of the pen. And we're not endorsing or criticizing the method. We're just reporting what the sources outline. It's a rapid institutional shift.
But lowering maternal mortality.
Or increasing adult female literacy from 2.4 years to the global average. You cannot achieve that with a single law or quota.
Because it requires physical and logistical infrastructure.
It requires complex, agonizingly slow, well-funded grassroots infrastructure. Think about the logistics of lowering maternal mortality.
It's massive.
It requires training thousands of specialized midwives and obstetric nurses, which takes years of education. It requires paying them a consistent wage, which requires a robust tax base.
It requires building reliable, paved roads so a pregnant woman experiencing hemorrhaging in a rural village can reach a clinic in time.
It requires equipping those remote clinics with sterile surgical supplies, blood banks, and continuous uninterrupted electricity.
And it requires deep cultural shifts to keep young girls in school rather than marrying them off as teenagers, which drives up the adolescent birth rate.
The stroke of a pen can put a woman in a parliament seat in Dakar, but a pen cannot magically pave a 50-mile road to a rural hospital.
Precisely. It illustrates that legal and political empowerment at the elite legislative level does not instantly equate to physical or economic empowerment at the grassroots level.
The 46% in parliament is the societal ceiling.
But the 2.4 years of schooling and the high maternal mortality represent the societal floor.
And right now, the gap between Senegal's ceiling and its floor is enormous.
It's a fascinating and honestly somewhat tragic paradox. The political will is clearly there. I mean, you don't pass a parity law and get to nearly 50% female representation without serious, aggressive political will.
Definitely not.
But the economic machinery required to translate that legislative will into basic survival and education for the average woman is lagging decades behind.
It's a stark reminder that national development is not a monolith. A country can be a global visionary in one metric and severely delayed in another simultaneously.
Which provides a perfect causal link to the final major piece of the puzzle we need to look at.
The environmental piece.
Because while Senegal struggles with these deep internal inequalities and infrastructure gaps, there is one global metric where their so-called lack of development actually puts them significantly ahead of the curve in our modern 21st century era.
You're talking about planetary pressures and the environmental footprint.
I am. Let's talk about the planet. In recent years, the UN realized that celebrating countries for achieving high HDI scores while simultaneously boiling the oceans was a flawed paradigm.
Very flawed.
So they introduced a relatively new concept to try and capture the environmental cost of human progress. It's called the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI, or the PHDI.
It's a brilliant and necessary evolution of the metric. It forces a real reckoning with sustainability.
The basic question it asks is, what happens to a country's development score when you penalize them for their carbon dioxide emissions and their material footprints?
If you achieve a high standard of living, but you destroy the atmosphere to get there, should your score really be considered a success?
Exactly. And the numbers for Senegal are wild in this context. What does the environmental data actually show?
Senegal's per capita carbon dioxide emissions are a minuscule 0.67 tons per year.
Less than 1 ton per person.
Compare that to the global average, which is over 4.5 tons per person.
And if you look at highly developed Western nations, that number is frequently in the double digits.
They are barely a blip on the global carbon radar.
Because of that incredibly light footprint, when you take Senegal's HDI and adjust it for planetary pressures to create the PHDI, the value only drops by about 3.39%.
The penalty is negligible because they aren't extracting a massive environmental toll to survive.
So they keep almost all of their development score when you factor in the environment. In contrast, what happens to the world average?
The world average HDI drops by over 10% when adjusted for planetary pressures. The highly developed world takes a massive numerical penalty for its carbon addiction.
There's an incredible irony here. The gap between Senegal and the rest of the highly developed world, that stubborn 0.226 gap we started this entire conversation talking about.
It actually shrinks when we account for the environment.
The developed world is suddenly much closer to Senegal when penalized for how they achieve that development.
It turns the traditional hierarchy of global development completely upside down.
But, I have to play devil's advocate here. Is this low carbon footprint a genuine, deliberate green strategy by Senegal? Or are we just romanticizing poverty?
That's the big question.
I mean, is their footprint low simply because they don't have heavy industry, they don't have massive manufacturing plants, and a huge portion of the population is still relying on basic agriculture?
That is the crucial nuance, and
Yeah.
you're absolutely right to challenge it. Currently, the low carbon footprint is largely a byproduct of underdevelopment.
Right, you can't emit industrial carbon without an industrial base.
Exactly. You cannot emit industrial levels of carbon if you lack that base. However, what is fascinating here is the economic potential this current state creates. It represents a massive macroeconomic concept known as the latecomer advantage.
The latecomer advantage, tell me how that works in practice.
The industrialized world built its entire wealth on a fossil fuel foundation over the last century and a half. Coal, oil, natural gas.
Yeah, that infrastructure is baked into every city, every grid, every supply chain.
Now, to survive the climate crisis, the West is agonizing over massive infrastructural teardowns.
It's like trying to change the entire concrete foundation of a house while you're still living inside it.
That's a great way to put it. They have to dismantle trillions of dollars of legacy fossil fuel grids, retrofit millions of existing buildings, and change entrenched, highly consumptive consumer behaviors.
Which is incredibly expensive, inefficient, and politically fraught.
But Senegal, on the other hand, is standing on a relatively empty plot of land holding modern blueprints.
Because they haven't built the heavy grid yet.
Yes. If Senegal can attract the global capital and technology transfers to build its emerging economy on renewable grids from the start, using localized solar microgrids, wind power, and next-generation green tech, they can leapfrog the dirty fossil fuel era entirely.
They skip the soot and smog phase of the Industrial Revolution completely.
They won't have to face the massive infrastructural teardowns in 30 years because they will have built it right the first time.
Their current lack of development means they have a clean slate to build a hyper-efficient 21st century infrastructure.
Rather than trying to frantically patch up a 20th century one.
That is a staggering thought. If they play their cards right, their current economic limitations could paradoxically be the blank canvas for a highly sustainable future.
It's the ultimate test of global climate finance. The structural opportunity to leapfrog is absolutely there in the data, but it requires the global community to invest in that blank canvas.
Okay, we have gone through a mountain of data today. We've traced 33 years of history. Let's pull all these threads together and synthesize what this analysis has actually revealed about the reality of Senegal's human development. We have identified 3 massive bottlenecks hidden beneath that headline HDI score.
The first is the education conversion deficit.
Right, the intern versus the senior management problem. Senegal has engineered great expectations for the youth, pushing expected schooling over 9 years, but they are crippled by critically low actual knowledge in the adult workforce, sitting at less than 3 years.
The foundation is poured, but the economic building isn't up yet.
The second is the deep health and gender inequality.
The paradox of power. We see incredible political representation with 46% of parliament seats held by women.
But a harsh daily reality dragging down the benefits of that power, exemplified by a dangerous maternal mortality rate of 260 and minimal schooling for adult women.
The political ceiling is sky high, but the survival floor is incredibly low.
And the third bottleneck is the economic anchor.
The wallet that hasn't grown.
Gross national income is lagging far behind the incredible public health gains in life expectancy. People are living 12 years longer, but their actual purchasing power has only grown by 43% in 3 decades.
Leaving them highly vulnerable to global economic shocks and trapped in informal labor.
When you look at these 3 bottlenecks, the ultimate strategic takeaway becomes clear. Senegal is unequivocally accelerating. The steep upward slope of their HDI since the year 2000 proves that.
The foundation for a modern state is actively being constructed.
But eliminating that 35.49% inequality penalty we discussed is vastly more urgent than just trying to boost raw GDP with foreign extraction contracts.
Because if the gains aren't distributed, the macroeconomic machine breaks down.
Exactly. Every single decimal point in this data set represents a human life. If that 2.4 years of female schooling can be structurally pushed toward the global average.
The locked-up economic, social, and innovative potential of half the population will fundamentally reshape the country.
Closing the gender and geographic inequality gaps is the most potent lever they possess.
It's not just about running faster on the global treadmill. It's about making sure everyone in the country is actually allowed onto the treadmill in the first place.
And making sure the treadmill is powered by something sustainable.
Right, exactly.
I want to leave you with a final, lingering idea to ponder on your own after we wrap up here. Consider everything we've talked about today. The stark paradoxes. Senegal currently possesses a clean environmental slate, emitting almost zero carbon, and they have secured incredible, world-leading political representation for women at the highest levels of government.
True.
If they manage to fix the plumbing, if they can close that massive inequality gap in grassroots healthcare, if they can get adult education up to global standards, if they can convert that high-level political will into bottom-up paved road infrastructure, they aren't just going to catch up to the developed world.
They could surpass it.
With their low-carbon, highly representative foundation already in place, could Senegal actually bypass our outdated, carbon-heavy, highly unequal models of Western development entirely?
It's a real possibility.
Could a nation currently ranked 178th in the world eventually show the rest of us what a truly modern 21st century society is actually supposed to look like?
The data suggests that while the current challenges are incredibly steep, that transformative potential is undeniably there.
It's a powerful reminder that progress is never just a straight line on a graph. It is messy, it is contradictory, and it is entirely human. By looking closely at the numbers, by refusing to just accept the average and digging deep into the paradoxes, we get to see the real story. Keep asking questions, keep looking past the headlines, and keep diving into the data.